obviously, if you prefer that, I'll jump back there. I also feel a little overdressed up here, but my wife told me that since going remote work and going back into the industry that I forgot how to dress. I'm trying to prove her wrong. Hoping Michelle over there takes a picture so I can send that back to Lauren. Okay, so today I'm going to cover 4 primary topics here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to frame the problem in terms of where we see it today from CrowdStrike's perspective, and then move into just a couple of topical hits on the threats in the AOR before going into the implications in terms of what this means for DoD, what this could also mean for industry, kind of give some ideas on what it is that how we can develop these capabilities and be better partners, and then some thoughts on the proposed way forward. So admittedly, from my background, I've got 23 years in and out of uniform and government service, and then also with industry. So I've worked for a couple of major players, one SI that I worked with, developing a couple capabilities over there for supply chain threat. Went into the federal government as a Blue Badger. I did that doing technical threats analysis on the counterintelligence side before becoming an agent. And then finally came back to my senses and said, hey, it's time to go back out to industry, read green, get spun back up on what the topics are and get back out on the edge, and then just kind of bring that back to bear for the government, for the American public. Otherwise, in terms of some of the one thing I wanted to cover here before I go deeper into the presentation, and I know this is going to be vendor agnostic, so I know some FCNs are out there like, hey, you can't be selling. That's not the intent of this slide. But I often get questions whenever I'm presenting on, hey, how is CrowdStrike coming to the conclusions that they do? What are they gathering? What are they seeing? And why are they saying what they're saying? This slide kind of puts it right here. So if you look, there's 6 primary categories where a majority of the vendors in this space, in terms of cyber threat intelligence, where they're pulling from. CrowdStrike is unapologetically over here on the endpoint telemetry side. That's from our deployed network of tens of millions of endpoint sensors across the globe in over 180 countries. And as a result, we pull in over 2 trillion unencrypted endpoint telemetry events per day. We do that, and we do the automated ingestion and processing, and that's what allows us to have the visibility across the global space. So I'm not going to go any further than that, unless you have questions on it. Rules of engagement on this one, I would appreciate if you do have questions, kind of wait. There's some logical pauses in the presentation. If you want to jump up and ask, by all means, please do. Otherwise, we can hold it to the end. I know that for those that are here for CPE credits, I think that scanner is kind of being very dogmatic and it's going to hold you until 11:55. So I'm not going to talk that long unless you want me to. Okay, so let's start. First, we're going to frame the problem here in terms of the modern attack. So if you look over on this slide here, over the last 30 plus years, this is kind of the spread of what we've been seeing in terms of how things have gone for adversaries and what they're doing. All right, as George Kurtz would say, our founder and CEO, you don't have a malware problem, you have an adversary problem. It's someone who's behind a keyboard that's going after you because you have something they want, or they want to do something to you. Does that make sense? That should be pretty clear. So when we're doing this, if you look in the past, a lot of the threats, like what we now know as malware, right? We didn't have that phrase back in the 90s. Viruses, Trojans, worms. I mean, a lot of that required direct action for somebody to go in, take a disk, or get into your system and put a script there. That's how this stuff started. Then it moved into the emails, right? Of course, then the adversaries caught on. When there's a better tool, when there's a faster way of doing something, what's the natural human tendency? You're going to move toward that. So they started moving into the automated threats, and you see the dreaded phishing word down there, still being used today, still very effective. But it moved into the ability to kind of push this out on an automated basis. And as you go through, now to the point where we just consider it as ubiquitous targeted threats. They are out there, you will never get away from them. If you are attaching or connecting to the open web, you will always face these threats. You should presume someone is always trying to attack you. And I hate to say it, some people don't like to hear this, but we say we stop breaches, but you should presume breach. And that also goes into a lot of the discussions nowadays about zero trust. Of course, zero trust means about 96,000 things to 96,000 people. But that's a separate presentation. I'm not going into that today. Okay. So with that, capabilities and intentions with a specific focus on what we're seeing out here. I mean, the biggest thing that you look, if you go across the X and Y axis there, on the X axis you see it's the capability of that particular actor, Y axis is the intentions. No surprise on that box up in the upper right corner, right? I think everybody's already seen this. But the interesting thing that we saw, particularly over the last 4 years, is the criminal space. Those folks, especially over COVID, you think they took a break? I mean, they were the original remote worker, if you think about it. So they did that, and that's a lot of the stuff that you saw out there in terms of the Colonial Pipeline, JBS Foods. You know, a lot of those big hits that happened during the COVID time started the supply chain issues, really kind of highlighting that. And then, of course, Russia, we saw that late last year in 2021, around December, when you started seeing with the Whisper A activity cluster, now Ember Bear, as they were going out and doing the destructive malware wipers on Ukraine as a precursor to their invasion. To kind of hit that point home, though, you know, over the 2-year time span from 2019 to 2021, there was a 300% uptick in adversary activity. But then over the last year, we had that same uptick. So it's just getting faster. Their OODA loops are moving faster. Their action loops are moving faster. However you want to characterize it, the bottom line is, with automation and the development of the capabilities, the adversary is getting faster. So I want you to hold that thought, though, because that's going to go into the later portions of what we've got. Additionally, one of the things that we saw, so at CrowdStrike, we kind of went into this concept of breakout time, you know, back in 2018. And what that is as soon as an adversary gets into your endpoint, how much time it takes for them to move laterally within your networks and start to move into exploitation. So you see, it was pretty long back in 2018, although some people would say that that's not very long, and if we characterize it today, it really is. In 2021, just in 3 years, that went down to 1 hour and 38 minutes. Now, the most sophisticated actors, we tracked them to about 18 minutes, and I think it was 52 seconds was the fastest one that we observed. So we have an Overwatch team that does that automated threat hunting and managed threat hunting for some of our smaller clients. That's what we watch. And then, of course, there's the depressing statistic, how long it takes for remediation actions, about 162 hours. And that's once you figured out that you've been hit. So if you think about SolarWinds and that supply chain attack, how long that took for detection, just think of how long they were already in there. So we're already, you know, as an industry, as cybersecurity professionals, some of us are already late to need on this if we're not thinking in those terms. The other piece of it, though, if you look from 2018 to 2021, malware versus malware-free attacks. This is the latest move that we're also seeing. A lot of folks are out there. I gave a similar talk last year to a bunch of industry executives on behalf of DoD. I'm not going to say which ones, but after the session, some of them came up. They're like, "Hey, great brief. You know, appreciate it. You scared the Jesus out of me, but we're doing great." Yeah, what are you using? Oh, we got this antivirus scanning software. Okay, all right. That presumes that you're going to have malware deployed against your systems. But right now, what we're seeing is a lot of the actors out there, 62% in 2021 of the attacks were malware-free, living off lane, as we call it. If you're corrupting native processes and native applications on the network, doesn't matter what IDS you've got up. Even if it's a behavioral-based IDS, it's not going to pick it up because it just kind of flies under the radar. So that's the one of the more frightening things that we're seeing. And as it moves along, that 1 hour and 38 minutes moved to 1 hour and 24 minutes last year. So they're getting faster. They're getting better. So what you got to do is you got to make sure that you're using the layered approach to address this problem. And then now 71% in 2022. If you have our global threat report, you'll see a lot of this stuff in there. It's free. Unfortunately, you have to put your email address in there, or fortunately for us. But yeah, you can download that copy of that report. That comes out about every February-ish, and there's a quarterly report that comes out as well. So take a look at that, and it has a lot more to expound on that. Identity, this is a big one. This is also some of the issues that we're seeing out here. If you look at that Forrester research, even Gartner has gotten behind this, over 80% of data breaches have a connection to privileged credentials. They don't even need to break your system. They're going right in with your folks' credentials. Those identities are for sale online. If you look on the deep and dark web, identity brokers are out there. You think about like one use case, Percussion Spider, also known as Drummerloo in other places. Those are the folks like the Turkish e-crime group. They're constantly offering credentials for sale. They don't care who it is, and they go for as little as $300. So think about the damage that's there. So you do have to have some sort of capability to kind of watch and do your identity protection in addition to digital risk monitoring. There's plenty of that out on the floor if you go out there, and they're also offering stress balls and t-shirts and everything else. So, but just to kind of prove a point, if you look at MITRE, right? These are the first initial steps of MITRE. And as you go into there, if you can bypass all these other traditional activities that took time, that took effort, just purchase the credential for $300 and you're off to the races, why wouldn't you do that? And this is what we're seeing the majority of today. This is where the attacks are moving forward, all right? So with that cheery news, we'll kind of move into what we're seeing out here in PACOM. So we call them pandas, we call them cholimas, right? And so within CrowdStrike, our primary, when we designate adversaries, we have about, I think it's 188 groups as of last week. That number keeps changing because at any given moment we're monitoring about 2,000 unaggregated activity clusters. And that way, as soon as we get enough attribution information, then we'll give them a cryptonym. It'll come in either state-based, criminal, or hacktivist, and those state-based will have an animal associated with it. So obviously pandas in China, and cholimas, for those who don't know, anyone here from Korea? Anyone speak Korean? I don't presume, linguists. All right, so that's the winged Pegasus that the Kims allegedly flew down on to start the North Korean nation. Of course, being a kid and growing up in Korea, I kind of laugh when I think about this because I used to watch those guys. It's no end to the entertainment. But either way, as far as China goes, so we'll start there. We're not going to go into the other. I know this is the big four slide, but China, you'll see, there's no surprises here. The biggest thing, though, is that as we're watching, this CVE targeting is the one thing that I always kind of shoe stomp, boot stomp, depending on what side of the fence I'm on. But those aren't going away. And it's kind of crazy that people, if you really think about it, your SOC personnel, a lot of your administrators, they're just overworked. There's just too much going on. There's constant CVE exploitation. There's new ones that are coming out. There's misapplication of configuration settings. We even see it where some folks will have straight out of the box and they don't fix the default settings. So it's kind of like leaving password 1 as your password. The adversary loves it when you do that. But for China, this is the big one here, where we saw this in the last Congress that they just had. Lots of key events, lots of key signals that were out there. Even seeing Hu Jintao being walked off the stage. I'm not a big, cinephile, so I don't study them too hard. I keep track of a lot of this stuff. But that was my sense is that was kind of Xi's way of saying, hey, there's a new era. Because there was a lot of Xi sees the Hu era, that those years there, as when China was kind of cooperating too much with the world and at a position of disadvantage. So there was a lot of signaling. So if you look at it, the biggest thing though, is he reinforced his last term's priorities. He wants to regrow the strength of the Chinese nation. They're still thinking about the century of humiliation. Unfortunately, a lot of people in the United States don't even know what the heck that means. But if you are a student of history and thinking about when the West first came in and then got a lot of people addicted to opium and took advantage of that, that's what they're still thinking about. We're focused on last year, over here. So just kind of think in those terms as far as the disparate perspectives that we've got. The other thing was this comment right here. When he said in his speech that they were going to stand up to hegemonism and power politics, who do you think that they had in mind? There's only one country that they're really thinking about, and it's us, right? The United States. So this is not going to be a problem that's going to go away. They're continuing their technological advances and their emphasis on that. And we're not giving them any reason to stop. If you look at the latest thing as far as the Chip Manufacturing Act, we're gonna start to pull away from that. That's a direct threat to their economy and livelihood. So even though it's not military, for those that have been to War College or even just studied the dime fill model, we're playing the different tools. And a lot of people don't recognize them unless there's some uniformed soldier out there. That's the most visible aspect of it. This one. I know a lot of people here in PACOM have that at the fore of their mind, the Taiwan Straits. They want to maintain that option. He's not going to back away from it. So this kind of frames in what she's thinking, and he's going to be there for the next 5 years. So with the intrusion activity, again, we're going to see that a lot of this is pegged to China's core interests. Right? They're going to keep going through. They're going to keep going in for political espionage, geopolitical intel, IP theft in order to do that leapfrogging and advance forward. And that shouldn't be a surprise to anybody in this room, right? But we really see a lot of this stuff kind of coming through. We haven't seen, to be honest with the intelligence, after Russia started, I don't want to say things quieted down, but they didn't increase. I know some people were speculating that, hey, China's going to take advantage and they're going to move in flaps and seams. We really didn't see too much of that. Okay? It was just kind of business as usual, if you will. Some folks speculate within our own shops that may be them trying not to exacerbate the situation already, given that they're already seen as a hostile, and that hasn't gotten any better. I think they thought that after the administration changeover 2 years ago that things might get better on that side, but it didn't. So otherwise, the only other key takeaway there is that this is one thing that a lot of people don't always think about. That whole of society ecosystem. So if you look at their apps, the products that they develop, I mean, a lot of that, while it goes toward individual citizens' convenience, the ability to go into one chat software, be able to order. What we have to do is, if we want it, we go through a constellation of apps, right? You got to go to Uber Eats. You don't like the restaurant on there, you got to go to DoorDash. You don't like that one, you got to go to whatever Grubhub. And then you got to pay for subway tickets on another app. You got to get your ride share on a different app. You got to look something up. They don't have to do that. It's all in one app. It's like Korea with Kakao and Tom, right? When that went down for a couple days, the country was going to fall apart. When I was reading the news, the head folks got up on stage and had to apologize to the country. I think one of them resigned as of 2 days ago. So, but that also provides a tremendous mobilization and surveillance opportunity. So you can, you've heard of the social credit scores that they have there, right? I know some people wish that they would do that with traffic scores over here based on when people are being jerks on the road. But that's really kind of what that moves. But that does pull in terms of the amount of data that they can mine and be able to sit through just on their own personnel, and then whatever apps that they're putting out of the data they're able to mine, think TikTok, right? I don't know that it's necessarily as much hay as people are making of it, but that back-end ability to be able to mine all the customer data here in the States as they go through until they do the forced bifurcation from ByteDance and put that firewall in between. I mean, that is a threat, and it's something that you just have to be conscious of. It's like, that if you live in a floodplain, what do you need? You need flood insurance, right? So if you're going to use that stuff, if you're going to operate in that space, you just go in with your eyes wide open. Some people don't do that. Here's one big takeaway I'd like for you to walk away with after this. China, the largest state-based cyber program out of all the adversaries we track at CrowdStrike. Okay? And this is as of Friday. So 50 of the 107 adversaries that we track that are state-based come from China. And if you look at the disparate, the number 2 and the number 3, they're kind of a surprise, right? Iran, and then you've got Russia. You'd think Russia would have a lot more, but only 11%, right? So it's only 12 adversaries, state-based adversaries with Russia. But they tend to move more toward using the criminal and hack into space. But this is something to consider here. So just think about the capability to mobilize if they have some sort of national level effort and they need to do that. That's one of the many tools that they have available for themselves. Okay? All right, let's talk a little bit about North Korea. Oops, I think I put that too fast. Sorry. All right, so there's a 5-year plan in January 2021. Kim, when he put that out, he recognized that there were some issues with their economy. They're still starving. They're not doing well, especially with COVID. That's another one. Whereas the Hermit Kingdom, they're not letting a whole lot of news out. So there's a lot of speculation. Just on what we can see on open source, I'm not behind the skiff wall anymore after I left my 3-letter agency last year. But I know that right before I left, there was a lot of problems out that way. So he's recognizing this. So right now, his big thing is currency generation and regime survival. Right? Because throughout history, it's littered with a track record of fail. If you are an authoritarian or a dictator, you get one mark in the L column, and that usually means that after that you're dead. And he knows this. He's watched. He's watched the likes of like Gaddafi, Saddam Hussein. That's what's informing his headspace right there. So as you go through, they basically they have not been at the fore until they launch a missile, but they haven't let up either. So with the currency generation side, the interesting thing is that we've been watching where instead of attacking the exchanges, where the cryptocurrency exchanges are occurring, they're actually going into the ledger and attempting to steal from there. And the currency that they have, this allows them to bypass sanctions. It also allows them to fund government, continue to put their folks overseas. It's funny, if you go through Dubai airport, anybody been through there? Flying Emirates, right? There's North Korean agents in and out of that airport in the concourse. I think it's the E concourse there. And I spotted a couple of them quickly went the other direction. But they're there, blue suits, real thin, Kim pins on the side, dead giveaway. But they're funding that to include a case where they just co-opted a Rock Army captain into espionage, and they were paying him through cryptocurrency. There was no hard cash that went through. And this was something that this guy was arrested earlier this year. So that's what they're really going for, along with attempting to shape the narrative. Of course, if you ever read that stuff, being able to read Korean, I see it, it kind of makes me laugh, especially with some of the flowery language that they use to describe South Korea as a lapdog of the United States. But this is one where this problem also is not going to go away. This is one that is a real life example I thought might be good for you all to see. So this is what's happening today. And this is actually happening to me right now. So my security department is involved. They're having a lot of fun with this. But so you can see Lavin told them, I don't know if it's them. We're kind of working that through to see if it is. But you get the innocuous person on LinkedIn, right? They have a name. It's usually depending on what they think you might be interested in. For me, apparently they think I'm interested in like mid-30s Chinese women. I'm not. If you look at my wife, she's not that either. But they put that on there and they start to say things like, hey, it's very fortuitous, our meeting is by fate, and things like that. I'm like, yeah, whatever. Okay, hi, how you doing? Like, I'll take the bait, let's see what you're doing. You start the conversation immediately after a couple of pleasantries are exchanged, then they ask for your phone number because they want to take you to WhatsApp or Line, which is one of the other newer chat softwares that's out there. And then from there, that's where they start to ask the questions. Hey, what do you do? Where do you live? Never answer their questions if you decide to play with them, but obviously talk to your SSO. But if you see this, you do need to let your younger soldiers, you need to let your other junior employees know that this is going on. Because then as soon as that happens, then as they're disguising themselves as HR professionals or other recruiters and things like that, I mean, that's a big vulnerability. Because what happens for all the personnel in uniform, right? ETS, UEAS, you retire. Everyone wearing uniform, U2, U3, 4, you all are like cartons of milk. You have an expiration date stamped on you. It's your MRD, your mandatory retirement date, or your ETS date, right? So you already know that is a vulnerability right there. But then let me ask you, how much time do you spend on training your junior Marines, your junior soldiers, your junior airmen, your guardians, the sailors, that this is happening? Because I can tell you, I didn't see this in my last information assurance training. Okay? But this is occurring. And we're seeing this not just here. I can tell you Iran also did this. If you think back 3 years ago, 2019, yeah, because I was actually mobilized overseas at that time. 2019, when Iran bombed a commercial ship, they actually used the same type of technique. They used the checkmate software to co-opt employees out at the port in Dubai, or in the UAE, excuse me. And that's how they were talking to IRGC officers that were posing as HR professionals and recruiters, but they were getting into their systems in order to do battle damage assessment, and then see what the response was going to be, and how they were going to harden the port in response to that bomb. So all of that goes through, and it's always the human, the weakest link, because you can flip as many keyboards as you want to try to see passwords written under there on a Post-it note, okay? But it doesn't matter. They're gonna figure, like humans go with, just like every other creature on this planet, can go with the path of least resistance, right? I can't remember all the passwords, but thankfully CrowdStrike gives me a password blocker, so I can use that and keep a unique one for every application, because the last thing you wanna do is that, I'm gonna ask, but I don't want you to raise your hand. How many of you use the same password for multiple portals? Because if you do, there's this thing, if you don't know about, password spraying or brute force attacks, they basically, if they have your email address, they can run it across multiple sites that you likely use. That email address, that password. And they'll just keep going, site to site to site to site until one clicks. And then it's just, they're trying the key that they found on the street, they're trying it in every lock around your house. That's tantamount to what that is. And your employees are doing it. Your employees are doing it. Okay. All right. So that's that on them. But yeah, they'll send malicious files as they work their target and develop it a little more. They'll start sending malicious files via email, posing as like a job application or something, and there's a script in there, and boom, they're off to the races. So, any questions so far? Yes.
Good morning. So going back to your slide that had where China takes up 47% of the threat actors, I'm curious, because I always try to think, like, how do they view us? Like, where would we fit in on that scale of, like, percentage-wise? Threat actors, like, doing those types of things?
No, that's a great question, and honestly, you're the first person who's asked me that. So, I'm pretty sure that they've got their own tracking mechanism. I don't have that. I can't tell you that. And I bet you, though, somebody probably over at NSA or Cybercom is tracking that type of perception. Not something we probably could get into here, but I can tell you right now, CrowdStrike does not necessarily look at that, but that is a great question. So I'm going to take that one back and see, because that is a good point. If you leave me your email address, if I do get the answer, I'll give it to you. Okay? No, good question. Thank you. Any other questions so far? Okay. All right. Implications for conflict. So this is something, I'm going to go with what a lot of people who work civilians, who worked military at one point or another, or if you're in industry, you know, and you've been around the military long enough, you know, most likely, most dangerous, right, when you're doing the military decision-making process. So most likely threat that comes with a lot of people within defense and government is right there, just those two big items. It's going to be credential theft and then harassment, right? So again, people fall for things. This is why, you know, within that information assurance training that you have to painfully go through every year, sometimes twice, if you have a dual persona, or 3 times. Not that I've ever done that. But you click on there, and they have those emails asking you, hey, does this look like a fake email? Does this look like phishing? And because of the fact that if you're on a desktop or a laptop, you can hover the cursor, you can see the address and know when it's just a little bit stub. Not to click it, you can't do that on your phone, right? So those kind of things are moving though. Because now people are posting phone numbers everywhere. You can get it on WhatsApp. You can mine those things. Very easy to do. If you look at things like mylife.com and those other data aggregators that are out there, they build whole profiles on you. I literally spent, when I first came out of government, I spent several days just Googling myself and going back about 10, 15 pages in just to see. And I was shocked because it wasn't on the first page. Right? Because thankfully there's a pediatrist in Fort Lee, New Jersey named Jake Want, and there's also a CNN producer. So they kind of drowned me off the first page, which is a good thing. But about 10 pages back, you start to see those aggregators, and they have your profile. And it's based off of public records. So potential addresses, potential phone numbers, your approximate age, who your relatives might be. And that allows them, in addition to the social engineering attempts, that allows them the access, and that's why you're seeing so much that are tied to identity. And then the other is just the typical harassment, defacing of web pages, ransomware if they're able to get in. I know that DoD likes to say that they really don't see it. No, ransomware's out there. And some squadrons, some lower level units at the company level, they might get locked up once in a while or have a user that does that, and then after they have captain's master in Article 15, they learn not to do it again. But the remediation that goes into it, that's the big pain point, because that costs money, that costs time. And that's time away from doing something else that your commander was attempting to do. The more dangerous portion of it, though, and this is something that we're starting to see now, is that what do you do when you have government and non-governmental cooperation? So now this ties back, and the reason why the flag is Russian instead of like Chinese or North Korean is because there are clear examples of this going on right now. No direct attribution to say that the SVR or the FSB or the GRU is pushing a specific button or sending an email to Cozy Bear or Fancy Bear or APT 2829, Iridium, whatever you want to call them. They're all the same. But that's the most dangerous thing. And if you look back, starting in February, all the way through, right? You had a Russian cyber army, or the cyber army of Russia that stood up on Telegram. You had the Ukrainian cyber army that stood up, and they didn't care. They said, we don't care what your skill level is. Come into this chat, volunteer, tell us what you can do, and we'll give you tasks. And so people were doing that. Whether it was just going through Twitter and flagging false posts, okay, all the way up to the more sophisticated actors who are able to do intrusion on networks, they were employing. That's how they crowdsource that, so to speak. Okay. The other thing is, though, is when you have it, if you think back to, anybody watch the Belarus cyber partisans? Did you hear about when a group tried to lock up the rail network in Belarus to stop the deployment of Russian equipment in the north side to kind of blunt the invasion of Kiev? Or Kiev? Yeah. That's happening. So just like how Russia treated Ukraine as their battle test lab, all the way back to like 2012, you think about 2014 when they turned out the lights, when they tied up government systems ahead of their invasion. These are all TTPs that they're kind of working through and perfecting, right? And this is not stopping. And if you don't think that China or North Korea or other countries are not watching and learning from this, then I need to get you a cup of coffee after this talk, okay? Because it's happening, all right? But this is the most dangerous scenario, and we're seeing this play out today. Even down to, so if you haven't heard of these guys, so KillNet, known, they used to be smaller, now they're out there as one of the groups along with AXNet. This says Cyber Army of Russia in Cyrillic, and so they're out there and they're using this. But the reason why I bring this slide forward from one of my other presentations on Russia-Ukraine is that KillNet, they went ahead and put that out there on the open internet and said, hey, there is a major defense contractor, I won't say their names, who is providing a weapon system, or they make the weapons that are being provided by the United States. I'm trying to keep it general, but you're probably going to be able to figure out who it is. But they ended up putting their addresses in 6 locations, office addresses, 2 in the United States, 4 in NATO partner countries, and said, if you bomb or burn this building and send us pictures, we will send you $50,000 in cryptocurrency. We've never seen that. So just imagine if they start doing that to residences here, with all the information that's out and available. If they figure out that you're a key player in some sort of organization and you're up on conflict, this is one of those things. But the other piece of it, though, it's not just there. With that demonstrated capability and intent, we have enjoyed for decades now, and if you watch it all the way through probably to the 80s, uncontested power projection. We can move quickly in and out of theater, and no one does any sort of actions against us until you hit the forward line of troops. But now, whereas we enjoy 2 oceans on both sides of the country, 2 countries that are north and south who are relatively friendly to us, depends on how much they want to drive up the price of maple syrup. But we don't have enemies on our border. We're not like Iraq, who's got Iran, this existential threat right on our border. Or if you look at like Israel, and they're just surrounded by everyone who wants to obliterate them, right? We don't have that. So we've taken that for granted. So now you can't take it for granted that you're going to be able to go port to port, port to theater, and then theater to the forward line without being contested. Because those TTPs are out there, where they're monitoring ships. They're changing GPS data. Think about that. You change that, you change flight plans, pathways, now you start having crashes. Or if they tie up a port, if you think about how bad that gets, there was a port study that I was a part of when I was at the SI that I mentioned. This was about 16 years ago. We did it for another country in Asia. $10 billion of lost economic activity for every day that port went down. And the trigger for that scenario was one simple bomb on a berth. And then everything else, ships just stacked back out. So if you look at like the port of LA right now, right? Ships stacked out for miles. And that's just still, they're cleaning out the supply chain backlogs that came from the pandemic. Imagine that if you're trying to go through the port of Beaumont in order to get Bradleys or Abrams out, because those things are heavy. At 75 tons, you can't put more than 2 of those on a C5, right? But how many C5s are you going to be able to get in and out of theater uncontested? How are you going to do that for Taiwan? Across the island chain. Across all that blue water for the sailors in the room. How are you going to maintain your sustainment bases if they're being contested? Maintenance. This is the big problem that I'm seeing. And they only need to buy time. They only need to buy a few days or a couple weeks, and then the calculated cost and difficulty becomes so great that we lose national will and political support for any sort of activity from the Pentagon. That's the takeaway there, folks. And that's why I say that we've got to partner in order to generate the adaptability and resiliency, and that's the key to deterrence from my perspective. So as we go into it, as far as that proposed way forward, now, I signed up and I sent my abstract, and then later I saw at the MWISE conference there was a guy from NSA that spoke, and he kind of said the same thing. So if you saw that, then bear with me for a few minutes. But the big thing here, and the one thing I want you to take away from this slide, if nothing else, is it within cyberspace and within cyber technologies and artificial intelligence, the capabilities are developing and improving faster than our capacity to understand them. Worse, when we look at the model of how we do assignments, talent management, and all that within the Department of Defense, how long does a uniformed person stay on station on average? 2 years, right? So it's the civilians who are really your bridge, right? Now we're also seeing it when you talk about cyber talent management, talk about the resourcing in terms of how many employees that are out there. There are more jobs, there are more requirements than there are actual humans that can go against them. Even if we put every single able-bodied person into one of those jobs, there's still not enough, and this is worldwide. So I was at another COCOM's cyber partnership summit that they had. So we went down there to speak, and one of the things that kind of jarred me was everyone in there was talking about, from the government side, we don't have enough people. Industry's hiring them out from under. They're paying them too much. They're not paying them too much. Industry is paying what the market would bear, right, in order to get the talent. Now that goes into larger force structure issues, and that's not something that I'm a consultant on, so I'm just gonna throw this out there and then walk away from it. But do you really want your most trained professional as a Lance Corporal or as a senior airman who's only making $35,000 a year? It doesn't matter what kind of service obligation you're going to put on that contract. That young man or woman, they're going to walk at the end of their 6 years. Or they might not sign up. And so we've also seen it in terms of the recruiting. I think the Marine Corps was the only one that didn't have this problem, although they kind of squeaked across the line. But the Army, the Air Force, the Navy, they're all struggling for recruits. Civil service, same thing. What's that?
Just because our numbers are low, that's in the
Yeah.
we still have a problem.
Yeah, but back to it though, in terms of like civil service, people aren't walking through the door because industry can pay more. But that's the thing is a lot of folks, so when I gave my presentation and then some of the guppies came up after and I said, guys, I'm not looking to hire your people out from under you. Honestly, every time I say that when you're approaching your ETS, your EAS, or your retirement, come talk to us because it is a significant shift in your journey. But if you want to stay in uniform, I encourage you to stay in uniform. I want to figure out how to partner with you and make it a better experience. But there's not enough. We hire out from under each other. That's the other piece. So you got to think about that too. So government and industry do have to partner up in order to build that talent pool, right, and to address that cyber skills gap. Because a lot of folks, especially because a lot of GS-15s aren't going to work in SOC. Okay, that's not how that works. And then the contractors, if you're contracting, if you're from industry and you've got one of the shops that provide that talent, the hard part is when you walk up and they're like, hey, your billable rates are too high. It's like, I can't get it into your shop without it. So there's that discussion and that free dialogue that has to go through. There has to be that building of trust. That 5-letter word that doesn't do very well on Zoom, WebEx, or on Teams calls, but you got to physically get in there and build that trust. Because for far too long, there have been instances where government feels burned by industry because of pricing models or different structures, right? But then concurrently, industry feels burned by government because of the way that contracts take too long, or the acquisition process does not allow for streamlined acquisition or procurement of those products. So when you use an industrial age weapon systems based acquisition system to pull in SaaS, whether it's SaaS, PaaS, IaaS, whatever other as a service capability, that model doesn't work. But yet that's what we go up against. And I would also encourage folks to think about the education of the acquisition professionals. Because oftentimes they're like, hey, you got, I'm not going to say the names, but if you got 4 threat intel providers, I should be able to pick one, and that's enough, right? But you remember those six columns of data that I had up there, those 6 primary sources? Every vendor has their niche, and they do it very well, whether it's just open source or incident response or endpoint telemetry. So the more powerful case is when you build a catalog of capabilities, because every warfighting unit has a different requirement. And industry has to help with that as well. Help the customer understand, hey, here's what we got, here's how you can use it, Yes, I would love it if you bought this for the entire Department of Defense. That's a great contract, right? I see some head nods from some of the other industry partners in the room. But at the same time, for the uniform folks, you want to provide the commander options. You want to provide that defender, that warfighter, options. So industry, that's what we got to do. And we can't go it alone. As we've been going it alone up to this point, it's been kind of adversarial. It needs to be more teamy. Okay. The final thing there, yeah, as I said, that one size fits all. We can't do that. We can't do that anymore. If we try to do one size fits all, if your acquisition folks, for those that are in government, see it that way, you're always going to be late to meet. But then concurrently from the industry side, if we describe it as, hey, we can do it all, in government, you probably want to like look at that person and hold your wallet. You're kind of lying. Because even we can't do it all. I'll freely say that. And nor do we want to, because it's a business. Okay? So with that, I hope this presentation was fruitful and informative. We've got about 15 minutes left until the top of the hour and 10 minutes until you can scan for those that are here for CPE credits. So at that point, I'll open it up for any questions you may have. Yes?
Hey Jake, Tyler, Seminar 25. Carl, right?
Yeah, that's why I was like, wait a minute.
So my question is,
You got a beard, man.
how much do you think the Navy or any services reserves can play a role in teaming partnership with the industry?
That's a great question. That's actually something that I've talked to Army Cyber about and the Coast Guard. And so that is one thing that we need to encourage. I think both sides could really benefit from that when it comes to industry, especially if we're pulling, young men and women out of uniform when they come up to the end of their terms of service. Encouraging them to go into the reserves, giving them that flexibility to do so. I know that I've benefited from that personally as a reservist. That's something that really kind of goes toward keeping that talent in the same sector. That way they can be, if you need them in uniform because you got to send them forward, you can mobilize them, right? But then it runs into the other problem. It's just like when we had COVID, right? When the pandemic was here. What was the biggest issue we had with healthcare professionals in uniform? We'd be very cognizant of pulling them out of their communities that also needed them. So as the pandemic was on the coastline, it was easy to pull from the Midwest and then deploy them out. But then once the pandemic started moving in and the coastline got caught up, then it was pulling those medical professions forward, or professionals, excuse me. Same thing with cyber, because again, limited amount of talent. So as we can, you have to be, there's a delicate balance. It's like the Goldilocks. You got to find that bowl that's just right. But in terms of your question there, yes, industry should definitely be leveraging skill bridge programs to bring people over, and make it a lot easier to transition in. I know that sometimes, and I've heard this from different partners when I talk to them and try to encourage it, they worry, well, if I'm only bringing them in for 6 months, they're going to see the crown jewels and then they're going to walk out and go to a competitor. That's not what this is about. Okay. And then from the government side, you can't assume that just because you kept them as a part-timer in uniform, that if you throw more money at them in terms of mandates and everything else, that they're going to be able to come on board because they still have to have a day job and the reserve's not going to pay their mortgage. So just something I'm a little intimately familiar with.
So if I could send a reservist to CrowdStrike for his 1 weekend amount or her 1 weekend amount 2 weeks a year, what could you or would you do with them?
So that is a program that we are actually wrestling with right now. We don't have a developed model, and I'm not going to get ahead of my skis on that one in terms of what that department's doing. But let's sync after this. I'll give you my card so that I'll find out where we are and what I'm allowed to share. Nice. Other questions? Yes.
You had a mention of, I think you called it disrupting search operations. I'm curious, you didn't say anything about it, I'm just curious what your thoughts are. On one of your slides, you talked about threats disrupting search ops.
You talking about for the mobilization side of it?
I think it was just, in my mind, search operations, so you're surging forces in, war fighting or humanitarian, because something happened, right? And from an adversary perspective, you could I think that's what you were getting at on your slide, was the threat could take advantage of trying to surge capacity for the cyber.
Yes, so two things. One is, yes, if there is, say, a kinetic operation that's getting ready to go and you need to surge forces and capability overseas, right? So you're going to start to stress the air bridges, you're going to start to stress the S-locks and G-locks, or excuse me, the sea lanes and the ground lines of communication. Yeah, they can fully take advantage of that. They can disrupt that. All they have to do is take nodes down, they have to take systems down. The one thing, so I was at a warfighter exercise while I was in uniform, and it made me grind my teeth to no end. Like my molars are nubs right now because of that. But all they had to do was go in and they changed a couple of zeros and a couple of digits in the running estimates, because I'm a sustainer when I'm in uniform. And it just completely threw us off. In terms of commodities, the quantity we were pushing, where we needed to push it, at what phase, what time, and it tied us down because then we had to go back on a couple days of data to redo the ledger and figure out where was that hit, and then what was the ground truth. And in that time, that buys the adversary time to do something else, because now you can't see. And that was one of the big things. In terms of surging for cyber operations, that is a nightmare scenario. Again, like you think about China with 47%, right? 50 adversaries out of 107 for state-based. That's not including criminals and hackers. So if they mass, it's like the old principles of warfare. If they mass fires on a target, what happens? It's going to take it down. So that's probably, I can't recall which specific slide it is. I think I mentioned it in 2 places, but
I think we're very vulnerable from the allied perspective. Because we cut corners, you've all been there. When we search for any reason, we cut corners.
sure.
We're very vulnerable. I think the adversary knows that.
Very good. Other questions? Sir?
So with any of this equipment that is used to do the things that you're talking about, the command control, the ISR, highly specialized, very expensive, Marine Corps buys it in little bits. Most of it is supported by industrial base that is here in New England. But when we go forward, I mean, our comments, planning guys make perfectly clear that fleet support representatives will not be coming with us. There is no tech reps on the EAD. Where we're operating is very remote, very austere, with this highly specialized equipment that the Lance Corps is operating. So it's going to break, right, in foreign lands. So how do we incentivize industry to place tech reps on foreign soil, to place spare parts available with purchase agreements or what have you, or maybe repair capability in some of these places that we're going to be, instead of shipping parts back and forth, evacuating equipment, that's 2 trips, it takes back and forth, it takes time, and there is no time. There's no distribution network is flawed. So that stuff, that support has to be remote operating, but we've got to incentivize industry to be able to partner with us there.
So that goes back into, no, great question, sir. That goes right back into the whole theme of this, which is the partnership and the discussions. So I know when it comes to some of the capability providers, of course, we're software as a service, so you're probably not going to have a CrowdStriker right there next to you at the front. But that's up for discussion, and you have to have those discussions ahead of time, right? That's the key thing. I know from the deployments that I've had when I was on active duty, yes, FSRs were at the front. They were right there in Afghanistan. Were they in each of the COPs that were out there? No, it didn't go that far, but at least it was in country, so you didn't have the tyranny of distance going back to like Kuwait or some other place. But that's really the key point is to get the discussion, because the other part that a lot of times senior warfighters just are not, aware of, because when you do uniform side for 20 plus years, you have a very, you see one line of it, right? On this side though, I automatically see, okay, so how much do I have to pay the person? What's their insurance benefits? Whether the insurance carrier is even gonna cover that person while they're in theater. So who do I need to get? And that whole aspect of human resources piece that is not really thought about when it comes to uniform personnel, because, hey, you got SGLI and you got TRICARE. Yeah, because of Title 10, and depending on the code, if it's a reservist, if it's a 12-302 order, you can mandate them to go over. That's the easy button. But when it comes to the FSRs, that's a little more difficult. But that's the open conversation that you do have to have, because that risk management, similar to like when you're talking to the general or the admiral, that risk management has to go all the way up to the senior vice president, even the C-suite level, in order to have that movement. I've seen some companies do it. It's not out of the question, but that should be a question that's being asked during the procurement consideration. Because again, if you're fielding a major weapon system, or you're fielding some sort of technical ISR system or other, over the horizon type system, yeah, when that breaks, how do you fix it? Because Terminal Lance is not going to know how to do that. Right? So, good question. Thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
What are some current operations that CrowdStrike has been supported or involved in, and did they enhance the information environment?
Good question. Let me answer that one carefully. So we do have presence within the intelligence community and Department of Defense. As far as once we provide our capabilities out to, say, three-letter agencies or other military agencies that are with, doing servicing Title 50 equities, we don't generally get that feedback. But the feedback we do get is particularly the threat actor information, the indicators of compromise, sometimes the reports. And this is not just for CrowdStrike, because I want to be fair to everyone, because this is FCS, so it's not supposed to be a CrowdStrike only thing. But all of those capabilities, the general feedback I've gotten is that it's shaved hours, it's shaved days and weeks off of work efforts for warfighters. And, it's all about preserving analytical bandwidth or targeting bandwidth. But the other piece of it is, as you start to think about, so in terms of operations, some of the other capabilities that may have maybe baked in to those systems because of vendor lock, because of past procurement decisions, as you overlay some of these other software as a service capabilities, or threat intel capabilities, they're functioning very well without breaking the system. That's about as far as I can go within what I was given my left and right limits as a speaker. But if you have other further questions, we can talk outside. I'd be happy to do so. Yes?
What could DoD provide to industry that would help impose greater cost to the adversary?
Help impose greater cost to the adversary. So that really kind of goes, as I think through that, that kind of goes to the authorities question, and I don't know that you want industry really going out to try to impose a cost on the adversary. Now, what can government do to bring industry in to enable government personnel to do the inherently governmental functions? There's a host of things. It gets back to just having the open discussion. One of the things that I cringe at, and I just saw this happen to one of our sales reps, he was going in just to talk. He wasn't going in with a pitch. He wasn't intending to sell anything. He didn't have a quote in his pocket. He was going in just to say hello, see how things were going, and have an update. Right? Immediately, he got a form back that said it was like a understanding, a memorandum of agreement of no cost, meaning that it wasn't going to cost the government anything to have that person come in, but there was no expectation of a deal. And we're like, what the hell is this? So it literally is, there's a phalanx of lawyers that are jumping up between senior decision makers and industry, and that's something that the individual commander has to get after. That's not something that we can knock down, because that wall of attorneys is pretty strong. But that also goes back to some acquisition professionals and that rivalry, right? Having those industry partnership days, having those discussions, those are very fruitful for the ones I've been to, where representatives get up and say, hey, I'm from this org, here are our requirements. This is what we're trying to do. Here's the solutions we have at this point. What can you bring to bear? And this is where we need your help. That's a start, right? But being willing to have that conversation, these kind of forums, these conferences, these kind of things, sending the right folks here, not just having, I don't know, I'm not gonna throw stones, because if I say it that way, it probably would sound that way, but having the right people who are empowered to make those decisions, but also understand the capability, that's the big step. Did that answer your question? I know that I kind of sidestepped a couple of the key.
No, I can understand. I think I know that IFCs and different artifacts, instead of doing that job, I guess, more defensively, to see where you make those lives better.
It just depends on what you want to do with it. I know one use case, so we've got a malware repository that's got over 320 billion samples in it, right? I don't know what this customer is doing with it. I have a pretty good clue, though, based on the discussions that we had when they were purchasing it. You can use your imagination from there. Okay, I got time for one more question. And I think the scanner now probably will work if you're here for CPU credits. Yes?
I already asked one, so if someone else has one, they better ask. But I was just curious, because the topic of the discussion is deterrence, right? Integrated deterrence. So they're coming off of a PME discussions in class that I recently took, cyber deterrence. What are your thoughts on that? And 'cause I feel like it's kind of this debated topic of what do you need, because in order to have deterrence, like, you have to know like what's going to happen and what's the reaction that's going to occur. So just kind of curious on, do you have any thoughts on that? Like, what would that mean from your perspective?
Okay, Jaquan's thoughts, and these are not the opinions or official positions of the Department of Defense, CrowdStrike, or any other entity. The biggest thing is just being open about it. People got to know where your red lines are at, but then there's also leveraging strategic ambiguity. So when it comes to using cyber within the cyber domain and using those tools in order to achieve deterrence, one, you got to signal that you have the capability to inflict as much pain, if not more, to the other side, right? We often, there is that balance that has to be struck though, because if you tell them every weapon you have, what do? It's an arms race. They immediately develop countermeasures, right? So that's one. The other piece is just not being afraid to say, hey, you cross this line, we're going to do something, and then do it. But that right there becomes something that's for the political masters, not for the uniformed decision makers, right? So those are probably the two big things. But the other part of it is just there are subtle ways to include. So the deterrence piece is always how can I, raise the perception of cost, right? So if you harden things too much, or I shouldn't say too much, but there's a little bit too much on some of it. But if you're hardening your networks, if you are participating, if you're engaging in partnerships with other nations, if you're doing that with industry and the other players that are out there, if they see that there's no white space and they assess that, and they being the adversary, then that's going to raise that cost of entry. And so it really starts to put the calculus in terms of what else can I get. The biggest discussion that I'm waiting to see the answers on. So I remember back in 2008. So if you read, because somebody mentioned Carlisle, if you read a parameters article, that's the War College Journal, it talks about Georgia's cyber left hook, right? So when Russia went into Georgia, they immediately started to attack the governmental servers of the country of Georgia. And what did they do? They moved it to a provider in the United States of America in the state of Georgia. I thought that was kind of like a little dig, and it was very clever. But it raised the cost because then they said Russia had to stop because they're like, well, what happens if we hit an ISP in the United States? Is that considered an act of war? Is that going to cross a red line? So that actually blunted Russia's efforts there to take down the government websites. So it's things like that and that creativity. If you can raise that perception, then off you go. But the other piece of it, though, and this is something that's just a larger thought, and I don't have all the answers because I'm not a law enforcement guy. One of the issues that we're seeing right now is the ubiquity of ransomware attacks and all of the other criminal stuff that's going on, right? Why is that? Well, if you really think about our laws and our structures and how we do things, if it crosses state lines, it immediately becomes a problem with the federal government, right? And that's the FBI. FBI only has so many thousand agents, but they can't cover the globe. And they're also chasing actual criminals that are doing other criminal work. So how do you get at someone who is in Russia, who's been kind of given the wink, wink, nod, nod by Putin to say, hey, hey, at that point, Carbon Spider, as long as your malware, as long as your ransomware deactivates whenever it detects a Cyrillic-based OS, I don't care. You go do whatever you want to do. If you do something back home, we got a problem. Yeah, that was very well done. Okay, but that's the kind of stuff that we have to look at, right? And that's out there, but we can't address it because what's the FBI going to do? The hacking group that was stationed out at St. Petersburg. And as long as we look at it as criminal activity, even when it's affecting national interests, that becomes a problem because then that tension comes in and we don't react fast enough. So if you're on the adversary side, what do you think? I got my money, let me move on to the next one. Right. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, I'm just interested in thoughts and discussions.
Okay. All right. Well, hey, thank you for the privilege of your time today. I appreciate you stopping by. And if you have any questions, we're